The sun set over the sprawling, immaculately manicured estate of Arthur and Jessica Beaumont, casting a golden glow on their mansion's high-arched windows. The crisp autumn air was filled with the scent of roasted turkey, cranberry sauce, and pumpkin pie. It was Thanksgiving evening, a time for family, gratitude, and indulgence. Yet, inside the luxurious walls of their mansion, not all was as peaceful as the world outside. Arthur Beaumont was a man of many accomplishments, wealthy, successful, and respected by everyone in the small Connecticut town where they lived. He owned a string of high-end restaurants across the country and frequently worked late into the night, expanding his empire. It was his dream to make a legacy, something grand enough that his name would last long after he was gone. Yet, in his pursuit of perfection, he left something behind: his marriage. Jessica, his wife of 8 years, was equally stunning and elegant. With her flowing dark hair and sharp features, she had once been the center of Arthur's universe. But as time passed, Arthur's focus shifted more toward his business, leaving Jessica to her own devices. The mansion they shared was lonely despite its grandeur, and the large social circles Arthur cultivated offered Jessica little solace. Though she was surrounded by people, she often felt invisible, a neglected figure in the shadow of her husband's ambition. This Thanksgiving, Arthur had thrown his annual grand dinner for friends, business associates, and the workers who maintained their estate. It was the sort of lavish affair that would leave the guests in awe: chefs flown in from different parts of the country, waiters in tuxedos, and chandeliers twinkling above long dining tables set with silverware that gleamed under the soft glow of candlelight. Jessica, draped in a deep emerald dress that hugged her figure, played her part perfectly, the charming, graceful hostess, smiling warmly at each guest as they filed into the dining room. She exchanged pleasantries, making sure that every drink was topped off, every need attended to. But her mind wasn't on the party. No, her thoughts drifted toward something or someone else entirely. Over the past few months, a certain presence had taken root in her life, a man whose company she had come to crave more than anyone else's. His name was Adam Kent, their gardener. He was everything Arthur wasn't: strong, rugged, and youthful, with tan skin and sun-bleached hair from working long days under the open sky. Adam had a quiet confidence about him, and his easygoing nature was a breath of fresh air compared to the stiff, business-oriented crowd Jessica had to endure. It had started innocently enough: casual conversations about the garden, brief exchanges about the weather, harmless comments about the roses blooming earlier than expected. But soon, the conversations grew longer. Adam's visits to the mansion became more frequent. Jessica found herself waiting for his arrival, looking out the window in anticipation as he worked, watching the way his muscles rippled under his shirt when he pushed the wheelbarrow across the garden. What began as curiosity evolved into something deeper, something forbidden. Jessica knew the risks, the danger of what she was feeling, but she couldn't help herself. Every stolen glance, every subtle brush of his hand when passing tools, felt like a secret only they shared. And on this Thanksgiving night, while Arthur entertained his many guests, her mind was somewhere far away, plotting the next stolen moment. As the dinner progressed, Arthur made a point of shaking hands, making toasts, and discussing his latest restaurant openings with his friends and associates. He seemed oblivious to the growing distance between him and his wife, or perhaps he simply chose not to see it. Arthur had always been the kind of man who believed that as long as the mansion was perfect and the bank accounts were full, nothing else could go wrong. But he didn't notice the look that passed between Jessica and Adam, who was helping to clear the tables that evening. The kitchen staff bustled around, clearing dishes and setting desserts while Jessica excused herself, heading toward the French doors that led to the garden. She needed air, at least, that's what she told herself. In truth, she needed to see him. Her heart pounded as she stepped outside, the crisp autumn air biting at her skin as she made her way through the garden, the path lit by soft, dim lights. And there he was. Adam was waiting, leaning against the side of the gardener's shed, his eyes locking onto hers the moment she appeared. She had no idea how he always knew, but he did. He knew she would come, just as she had known she couldn't resist. "Shouldn't you be inside?" Adam asked in that low, gravelly voice that sent shivers down her spine. Jessica stepped closer, her breath visible in the cool night air. I needed to get away. It's too much in there. He raised an eyebrow, smirking. You don't seem like the type to get overwhelmed. She let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. You don't know me as well as you think. Don't I? Adam's eyes darkened as he reached out, taking her hand. I think I know you better than anyone in that house. For a moment, they stood there, close enough to feel the heat radiating from each other's bodies, but not touching beyond that single point of contact. Their hands clasped, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. Jessica knew this was dangerous, knew she was crossing a line she could never uncross. But she also knew that in this moment, standing here with Adam, she felt more alive than she had in years. Before she could stop herself, she stepped closer, closing the distance between them. Adam's hand moved to her waist, pulling her gently against him, his lips hovering just inches from hers. Jessica, he murmured, his breath warm against her skin. Are you sure about this? But Jessica didn't answer with words. Instead, she closed the gap, her lips finding his in a kiss that was slow, deep, and filled with all the longing she had buried for so long. In that moment, everything else faded away. The guests, the mansion, even Arthur. All that mattered was the heat of Adam's body against hers, the way he made her feel desired, alive, real. And as the soft glow of the mansion's lights flickered through the garden, Jessica knew there was no going back. Not after this. Jessica's heart pounded in her chest as she pulled away from Adam, her mind racing with what had just happened. For a brief moment, their kiss had wiped away all thoughts of her life inside the mansion, but now reality was creeping back in, bringing with it a heavy sense of guilt. She had crossed a line that she had only dreamed of skirting, and there was no undoing it. Adam's eyes searched hers, as if trying to read the emotions dancing across her face. Jess, are you? She placed a finger to his lips, silencing him. Don't. Not here. Not now. They stood there in silence for a moment, the cool night air swirling around them. She could still hear the distant clatter of silverware and the murmur of conversation from the mansion, a stark contrast to the charged quiet between her and Adam. The smell of freshly turned soil and damp leaves filled her nostrils, grounding her in the moment. But Jessica knew they had to return to their separate worlds soon, before anyone noticed her absence. I have to go back inside, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Adam's hand tightened briefly around her waist before releasing her. I'll be here, he said, his voice soft yet certain. She didn't respond, only nodding before turning and making her way back up the stone path toward the mansion. Each step felt heavier than the last, her mind swirling with conflicting emotions, exhilaration, guilt, and the cold bite of reality that came with what she had just done. As she approached the French doors, Jessica paused, her hand hovering over the glass handle. Could she really go back inside, pretend as if nothing had happened? Could she face Arthur, her husband, who was completely oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface? The question echoed in her mind as she finally opened the door and slipped back inside. The warmth of the house enveloped her immediately, and the sounds of laughter and conversation once again filled her ears. The large dining room was still bustling with activity, guests laughing over drinks, others helping themselves to second servings of pie. Arthur stood near the head of the table, entertaining a group of his closest friends, his deep voice carrying over the room. He hadn't even noticed her absence. It was both a relief and a sting to her heart. Once, he would have noticed immediately, would have come to find her, worried about her well-being. But now, it seemed she could disappear for hours, and it would make no difference. Jessica quietly slipped back into her role as hostess, moving from guest to guest, refilling drinks, offering polite smiles. But all the while, her thoughts were with Adam. She could still feel the warmth of his touch, the lingering sensation of his lips on hers. It was as if a part of her had been left behind in the garden, tethered to him. As the night wore on and the party began to wind down, Arthur finally approached her, his arm slipping around her waist in a gesture that was more for appearances than affection. Everything all right, darling? He asked, his eyes scanning her face briefly before shifting to the guest behind her. "Yes, fine," she replied, her voice smooth and controlled, the perfect mask. She had become so good at it over the years, hiding her true feelings, playing the part of the doting wife. Arthur didn't press her further, instead turning back to his friends, who were in the midst of discussing the latest stock market fluctuations. It was always work with him, always business. Jessica smiled politely as they talked, but her mind was elsewhere. By the time the last of the guests had left, the mansion was quiet, save for the soft sounds of the cleaning staff clearing the remaining dishes and tidying up. Arthur disappeared into his office, no doubt to check his emails or go over some late-night contracts. It was his routine, a routine that left Jessica alone more often than not. She wandered through the house aimlessly, her fingers grazing the smooth surfaces of the antique furniture, the ornate frames that lined the walls. The house was beautiful, elegant, and so utterly lifeless. It had been a symbol of their success, of Arthur's relentless drive to give them the best of everything. But somewhere along the way, he had forgotten that the best of everything meant nothing if there was no warmth, no love to fill it. Eventually, Jessica found herself standing by the large window overlooking the garden. The moonlight bathed the lawn in a soft, silvery glow, and there, in the distance, she could just make out the silhouette of the gardener's shed. Her heart skipped a beat as she wondered if Adam was still there, waiting for her. Part of her wanted to go back, to lose herself in the passion she had felt only moments ago. But another part of her, the rational part, knew that what they had done tonight could only lead to disaster if they weren't careful. She turned away from the window and made her way upstairs, her feet moving silently across the plush carpet. When she entered their bedroom, Arthur was already in bed, his laptop open on his lap, the soft glow of the screen casting shadows on his face. "You coming to bed?" he asked without looking up from whatever document he was reading. "In a minute," Jessica replied, her voice flat. She moved to the bathroom, shutting the door behind her, and leaned against the cool marble counter, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her mind was a tangle of emotions. The face staring back at her looked calm, composed, but inside, she felt anything but. How had things come to this? How had she gone from being the happy, vibrant woman who had once loved Arthur with every fiber of her being, to this, a woman who had just kissed another man in the shadows of her own garden? Jessica closed her eyes, the guilt rising up in her throat like bile. She loved Arthur once, truly, deeply loved him. But over the years, as he became more consumed with his work and their marriage took a back seat to his ambitions, something in her began to wither. She had tried to talk to him, to make him see that they were drifting apart, but he always brushed her concerns aside, promising that things would get better once this deal closed, or that restaurant opened. But things never got better. Jessica opened her eyes, her reflection once again staring back at her, accusing and silent. She had done something unforgivable tonight. But at the same time, it felt like a line that had been crossed long before Adam ever came into her life. The distance between her and Arthur had been growing for years, and she had been powerless to stop it. She turned off the bathroom light and climbed into bed beside Arthur, who had already closed his laptop and was scrolling through his phone. He barely looked at her as she slid under the covers, his focus completely on the glowing screen in his hand. "Good night," he said absently, placing his phone on the nightstand before rolling over. "Good night," Jessica whispered back, staring up at the ceiling. Sleep eluded her that night, her mind replaying every moment of her encounter with Adam. The memory of his touch lingered, haunting her as she lay in the darkness. She knew this couldn't happen again. It was too risky, too dangerous. But deep down, a part of her knew that it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The days following Thanksgiving were a blur for Jessica. Her life seemed to move on autopilot, with each passing day bringing her closer to the inevitable confrontation with her emotions. She tried to distract herself with the routine of running the household, overseeing the staff, attending to her social obligations, and maintaining the illusion of a perfect marriage. But every time she passed the garden, her thoughts would wander back to Adam. She couldn't help it. The pull toward him was undeniable. It was as though that kiss on Thanksgiving night had opened a door she couldn't close, no matter how hard she tried. Arthur, predictably, had returned to his workaholic routine. He was at the office until late most nights, too engrossed in his latest business venture to notice that something had changed with his wife. He spoke to her about stock portfolios, new restaurant openings, and potential business trips, but never asked how she was doing, how she felt. It was as if Jessica was part of the mansion, an elegant fixture to be admired but ultimately ignored. One morning, as Jessica sat in the sunroom, sipping her coffee and staring out at the frost-covered lawn, she heard the familiar hum of the lawnmower in the distance. Adam was out there again, as he had been every day since Thanksgiving, meticulously tending to the garden as if it were his personal masterpiece. She had avoided speaking to him since that night, telling herself that it was for the best, but her resolve was weakening. That morning, the temptation was too strong to ignore. After a long internal debate, she set her cup down and made her way outside, pulling her coat tightly around her against the chilly November air. The crisp leaves crunched beneath her feet as she walked across the yard, the morning sun casting long shadows over the garden. Adam was bent over a flower bed, his back turned to her, completely unaware of her approach. When she reached him, she paused, watching him for a moment. His shirt was damp with sweat despite the cold, and the muscles in his arms flexed as he worked. She felt her breath catch in her throat, her heart racing just as it had on Thanksgiving night. Finally, Adam straightened up, sensing her presence. He turned, his face breaking into a slow smile when he saw her standing there. "Morning, Jessica," he said, wiping his hands on a rag before tucking it into his back pocket. "Morning," she replied, her voice softer than she intended. She wasn't sure what she had come out here to say, what she wanted. But now that she was standing in front of him, all her carefully constructed defenses seemed to crumble. They stood in silence for a moment, the distance between them filled with unspoken tension. The air felt heavy, almost electric, and Jessica knew that if she didn't leave now, she would be swept up in something she couldn't control. But she didn't leave. "How've you been?" Adam asked, his voice gentle, as if he could sense her turmoil. Jessica shrugged, glancing away. "Busy, I guess." "You?" "Same," he said with a small chuckle. "Though, I've been thinking about you." The words hung in the air between them, laden with meaning. Jessica's pulse quickened, but she kept her gaze fixed on the garden, refusing to meet his eyes. If she did, she wasn't sure she'd be able to stop herself from closing the gap between them. "You shouldn't," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This can't happen, Adam." "I know," he said, his tone serious now, "but that doesn't change the fact that it already did. You felt it too, didn't you?" Jessica closed her eyes, willing herself to stay composed. She couldn't deny it. Of course, she had felt it. That night in the garden had stirred something in her, something she hadn't felt in years, a sense of excitement, of being wanted. Arthur hadn't made her feel that way in a long time. But no matter how much she wanted to explore whatever it was that had blossomed between her and Adam, she couldn't ignore the reality of her situation. She was married, and this, whatever this was, could destroy everything. "I'm married," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I can't just throw that away." Adam took a step closer, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "I know you're married, Jess, but are you happy?" The question hit her like a punch to the gut, knocking the wind out of her. Was she happy? She hadn't asked herself that question in years, had stopped even considering her own happiness the moment Arthur's work became more important than their marriage. She had convinced herself that the life they had built, the mansion, the wealth, the prestige, was enough. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper. Adam reached out, gently taking her hand in his. His touch was warm despite the cold, and the simple gesture sent a shiver down her spine. "You deserve to be happy," he said softly. "And if Arthur's not giving you that, then maybe it's time to start thinking about what you need." Jessica looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. There was a part of her that wanted to listen to him, to believe that she deserved more than what she had settled for. But another part of her, the rational, responsible part, knew that giving in to this temptation could ruin everything. She had a life, a reputation, a marriage, even if it was falling apart at the seams. "I can't, Adam," she whispered, pulling her hand away. "It's not that simple." He nodded, his expression somber. "I know. I'm not asking you to make a decision right now, but I think you owe it to yourself to be honest. Do you want to spend the rest of your life living like this? In a marriage where you're just existing?" The words cut deep, and Jessica felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She had been asking herself that very question for years, but had never allowed herself to answer it. And now, standing here with Adam, the answer felt closer than ever. "I don't know," she said again, her voice breaking. I don't know." Before she could say anything else, the distant sound of Arthur's voice calling her name echoed across the garden. Jessica stiffened, her heart leaping into her throat. She couldn't let Arthur see her like this, not now. "I have to go," she said quickly, stepping back from Adam. He nodded, though the disappointment in his eyes was unmistakable. "Take care, Jess," he said softly. Jessica turned and hurried back toward the house, her heart racing. When she reached the back door, she paused, glancing over her shoulder one last time. Adam was still standing there, watching her with an unreadable expression. As she stepped back inside, she felt a rush of cold air against her skin, but it wasn't just the weather that made her shiver. It was the realization that she had crossed another line today, a line that brought her even closer to the point of no return. The days passed slowly, each one marked by a growing sense of restlessness inside Jessica. She went through the motions of her life, attending charity events, overseeing the house staff, and playing the part of the perfect wife. But beneath the surface, she was unraveling. Every time she saw Adam, her resolve weakened a little more. And every night, as she lay beside Arthur, listening to the soft click of his laptop keys or the quiet buzz of his phone, she felt more distant from the life she had once believed in. It was only a matter of time before something gave. Jessica's life moved in waves of guilt and temptation, the days slipping past in a blur of routine and unspoken desires. Arthur was busier than ever, preparing for an overseas business trip that would last nearly 2 weeks. His absence should have given Jessica a sense of relief. After all, she could use the time to figure things out without the constant presence of her husband reminding her of the life they had built together. But instead, it filled her with dread. Arthur was leaving, and with him gone, Jessica feared she might lose control entirely. It was a chilly December afternoon when Arthur finally left for the airport. His goodbye was as formal as it always was, a peck on her cheek, a half-hearted promise to call when he landed, and a quick reminder to oversee the staff while he was away. Jessica watched him go, standing in the doorway as the black SUV rolled down the long driveway toward the gates. When it disappeared from sight, she felt the weight of the empty house press down on her. She spent the rest of the day trying to distract herself. She wandered through the mansion, checking in with the staff, attending to small tasks that didn't really need her attention. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling of restlessness that gnawed at her. By evening, the house had grown quiet, with only the distant hum of the television in the living room breaking the silence. Jessica sat by the fireplace, a glass of wine in hand, staring into the flames as they danced and flickered in the hearth. Her mind wandered, as it always did, to Adam. She hadn't seen him much since that morning in the garden. They exchanged glances every now and then when she passed him outside, but neither of them had spoken about what had happened. It was like they were both afraid to acknowledge the connection between them, as if putting it into words would make it impossible to ignore. But now, with Arthur gone and the house empty, Jessica knew she couldn't hide from her feelings anymore. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from Adam. "Can we talk?" Her heart skipped a beat, and she stared at the message for a long moment, her mind racing. She knew she shouldn't respond. She knew that nothing good could come from this. But the pull toward him was stronger than her willpower, and before she could stop herself, her fingers were typing a reply. "Meet me in the garden. 20 minutes. Jessica set the phone down and took a deep breath, trying to calm the rapid beating of her heart. She stood and made her way upstairs, grabbing a thick coat and scarf from the closet. The house felt colder than usual, Or maybe it was just the tension that seemed to fill every corner of her world. The garden was dark and quiet when she stepped outside, the crisp winter air biting at her skin. The path was illuminated by small ground lights, casting soft pools of light across the gravel. She made her way toward the familiar spot where they had kissed that night, her pulse quickening with each step. Adam was already there, leaning against the side of the gardener's shed, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket. He looked up as she approached, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. The tension between them was palpable, thick like the cold air that hung around them. Jessica stopped a few feet away from him, her breath visible in the night air. "You wanted to talk?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended. Adam nodded, pushing away from the shed and taking a step closer. "Yeah, he paused, running a hand through his hair, as though searching for the right words. "I can't stop thinking about you, Jess." Her breath caught in her throat. She had known this was coming, had felt it building for weeks. But hearing him say it out loud made it real, made it impossible to ignore. "Adam, we can't," she began, but her voice faltered as he closed the distance between them. "Why not?" he asked, his voice soft but intense. "You're not happy, Jessica. You said it yourself." "I didn't say that." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. She hadn't used those exact words, but it was the truth nonetheless. "You don't have to," Adam said gently, his eyes locking onto hers. "I see it every day. I've seen it for months now. You deserve more than this life, Jess. You deserve to be with someone who sees you." Jessica looked away, blinking back the tears that had begun to well in her eyes. He was right. Arthur didn't see her, hadn't truly seen her in years. She had become a part of the furniture, a fixture in his perfectly curated life. But Adam saw her. He made her feel alive again, made her feel like more than just the wife of a successful businessman. But she couldn't just throw her life away, could she? She had spent years building this life with Arthur. They had a history, a marriage. Could she really walk away from all of that for the uncertainty of something new? Something dangerous? "I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. Adam reached out, gently taking her hand in his. His touch was warm, comforting, and she felt herself relax just slightly. "You don't have to decide anything right now," he said softly. "But just don't close yourself off to the possibility of something different, something better." Jessica closed her eyes, her mind spinning. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that she deserved more than the hollow marriage she had found herself in. But the fear of the unknown, the fear of what might happen if she took that leap, held her back. "I need time," she said finally, pulling her hand away. "I can't do this right now." Adam nodded, though there was a flicker of disappointment in his eyes. "I get it. I'm not trying to push you, Jess. I just want you to know that I'm here. Whatever you decide, I'm here." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, Jessica took a step back, breaking the spell that had held them together. "I should go," she said quietly, turning to leave. "Jess," Adam called after her, and she stopped, turning back to look at him. His expression was earnest, raw. "Take care of yourself, okay?" Jessica nodded, a small, sad smile tugging at her lips. "You too." She walked back to the mansion, the weight of Adam's words heavy on her shoulders. Her mind raced with thoughts of what could be, of the life she could have if she chose to walk away from Arthur. But every time she let herself imagine it, the fear crept back in, reminding her of everything she stood to lose. When she reached the house, she slipped inside and made her way up to the master bedroom. The large bed felt cold and empty without Arthur's presence beside her, but for the first time in a long time, Jessica wasn't sure if she missed him. She lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling as the events of the day played over and over in her mind. She had tried so hard to push her feelings for Adam aside, to convince herself that she could live with the choices she had made. But now, with Arthur gone and the house empty, those feelings were harder to ignore. The truth was, she wasn't happy, and no amount of pretending would change that. As the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, Jessica made a decision. She couldn't keep living like this. Not anymore. The next few days passed in a haze. Jessica threw herself into the routine of running the house, avoiding the growing tension in her chest. Adam kept his distance, respecting her need for space, but she could feel his presence in the garden every time she looked out the window. It was like he was always there, a constant reminder of the choice she was avoiding. But no matter how much she tried to distract herself, the truth lingered in the back of her mind. She had to decide, and soon. The mansion was silent that evening, the air thick with an unspoken heaviness. Jessica stood by the window in the living room, staring out at the garden where Adam worked. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the lawn. Her heart raced as she watched him, the weight of her decision pressing down on her chest. Was she really going to do this? She didn't have the answer yet, but she knew she couldn't keep running from it forever. The days passed like falling leaves, slow but inevitable, as December crept toward Christmas. Arthur's absence stretched on, leaving Jessica alone with her thoughts in the massive mansion. Without him around, the house felt like a hollow shell, each room a reflection of the emptiness she had been carrying inside for years. The isolation only deepened her connection with Adam, though they hadn't spoken since that night in the garden. She tried to bury herself in her responsibilities, but Adam was always there, his presence lingering in the back of her mind like an unspoken promise. And now, with Christmas just days away, the weight of the holiday only seemed to amplify everything Jessica had been trying to ignore. She couldn't escape the truth any longer. Her marriage was falling apart, and the cracks were growing wider with every passing moment. One cold afternoon, as she sat by the fireplace wrapping Christmas gifts, Jessica's phone buzzed. She set down the shiny paper and glanced at the screen, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the message from Arthur. Landing late tonight. Have some meetings in the morning, so I'll be home tomorrow evening. We'll talk then. Jessica's stomach twisted into knots. Talk. That single word felt heavier than the entire conversation they hadn't had in years. Arthur wasn't a man of many words, and any time he suggested they talk, it usually meant something serious was on his mind. She wondered if he had sensed something, if he knew the distance between them had grown into something far worse than either of them had admitted. She set her phone down, staring at the fire as it crackled in the hearth. The warmth should have been comforting, but instead, it only reminded her of how cold everything else felt. Tomorrow Arthur would be home, and Jessica knew that she would have to face him, face the reality of their fractured marriage. For years, she had been able to keep up the facade, to pretend that things were fine. But now, with Adam in her life, everything had shifted. She couldn't go back to pretending anymore. She stood and made her way to the window, the frost-covered panes shimmering in the fading daylight. Outside, the garden stretched out in a blanket of white, untouched by footsteps. But beyond the pristine snow, she saw Adam by the gardener's shed, working even in the cold. She watched him for a moment, her mind swirling with memories of their time together, the way his touch had ignited something inside her that she thought was long gone. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. Adam, need to see you. Meet me by the shed in 10. Jessica's heart raced as she stared at the message. She knew she shouldn't go. She knew that meeting him again would only complicate things, especially with Arthur coming home the next day. But her resolve was weakening, and the pull toward Adam was too strong to ignore. Before she could overthink it, she grabbed her coat and slipped it on, making her way to the back door. The cold air hit her like a shock as she stepped outside, the crunch of snow underfoot the only sound in the stillness of the garden. When she reached the shed, Adam was already there, leaning against the doorframe, his breath visible in the frosty air. He looked up when he saw her approaching, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. "Hey," he finally said, his voice low and soft. "Hey," she replied, wrapping her coat tighter around her. "What's going on?" Adam ran a hand through his hair, his expression unreadable. "I couldn't stand the silence anymore," he admitted. "I needed to see you." Jessica swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. She had been avoiding this moment for days, pretending that if she stayed away from him, it would somehow make everything easier. But now, standing here with him, she realized how foolish that had been. "You're not making this easy," she said quietly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't want to make it easy, Jess," Adam said, stepping closer. His breath was warm against her skin, even in the cold. "I want you to know how much I care about you." She looked away, blinking back the sudden rush of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. "I can't do this," she whispered. "Arthur's coming home tomorrow. We can't keep doing this." Adam's jaw tightened, his eyes searching hers. "You don't have to stay with him," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "You deserve better, Jess. You deserve to be happy." Jessica closed her eyes, the tears burning behind her eyelids. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that she deserved more than the life she had settled for, that there was still a chance for her to find happiness outside of her marriage. But the fear of the unknown, the fear of what she would lose if she left, kept her rooted in place. "It's not that simple," she said, her voice breaking. Adam reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was soft, but it sent a jolt of electricity through her. "I know it's not simple," he said quietly, "but it's worth it. You're worth it." Jessica opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. The intensity in his eyes, the raw emotion, was almost too much to bear. For so long, she had felt invisible, unseen by her husband, by the world around her. But Adam saw her. He had always seen her. But she couldn't escape the guilt gnawing at her, the fear that she was about to make a terrible mistake. "I need more time," she said, stepping back from him. "Arthur's coming back tomorrow. I need to figure things out." Adam's expression softened, though the disappointment was clear in his eyes. "I get it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I won't wait forever, Jess." Her heart twisted painfully at his words. She didn't want to lose him, didn't want to give up the connection they had built. But she knew that she couldn't make any decisions until she had spoken to Arthur, until she had faced the truth about their marriage. "I know," she said quietly. "Just give me a little more time." Adam nodded, though she could see the hurt in his eyes. "I'll be here," he said softly, "but don't wait too long." Jessica swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to make him understand the turmoil she was feeling. Instead, she nodded and turned to leave, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision she knew she would soon have to make. That night, Jessica lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as the hours ticked by. The mansion was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant hum of the furnace as it fought to keep the cold at bay. She couldn't sleep, her mind racing with thoughts of Adam, of Arthur, of the life she had built and the one she might be willing to throw away. She had never imagined that her marriage would come to this, a crossroads where every decision felt like a betrayal. For years, she had convinced herself that she could live with the distance between her and Arthur, that their comfortable life was enough. But now, with Adam in the picture, everything had changed. And tomorrow, when Arthur came home, she knew she would have to confront it all. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling her from her thoughts. She reached for it, her heart racing when she saw another message from Adam. "I'm here if you need me." The words were simple, but they carried so much weight. Jessica stared at the screen for a long moment, her chest tightening with the pull of temptation. She wanted to respond, wanted to reach out to him, to fall into the comfort of his arms. But she knew that if she did, there would be no turning back. Instead, she set the phone down and closed her eyes, willing herself to find sleep. Tomorrow would bring answers, one way or another. The next day, the hours passed in a blur as Jessica waited for Arthur to return. She busied herself with last-minute preparations for the holidays, trying to keep her mind occupied. But no matter how hard she tried, the tension in her chest refused to ease. It was late afternoon when she heard the sound of Arthur's car pulling into the driveway. Her heart leapt in her chest as she wiped her hands on a kitchen towel and made her way to the front door, trying to prepare herself for the conversation that was to come. Arthur stepped inside, shaking the snow from his coat before draping it over the chair by the door. He looked tired, his face lined with exhaustion from the long flight and the business meetings that had filled his schedule. "Hey," he said, offering her a tired smile. "Sorry I'm late. It's been a long trip." Jessica nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "It's okay," she said quietly, forcing a smile. You must be exhausted. Arthur ran a hand through his hair, sighing as he made his way into the living room. Yeah, it was a lot. But we'll talk later, okay? I just need to unwind. Jessica followed him into the room, her pulse quickening with every step. She knew that the conversation they needed to have couldn't wait. She couldn't keep pretending anymore. Arthur, she began, her voice trembling, there's something we need to talk about. He looked up at her, his expression curious but not alarmed. What is it? Jessica's hands trembled as she searched for the right words, knowing that whatever came next would change everything. I'm not happy, she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. Arthur sat back in his chair, his brows knitting together in confusion as he processed Jessica's words. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out at first, as if he wasn't sure how to respond to a statement he wasn't expecting. What do you mean? He asked slowly, his voice laced with exhaustion. Not happy how? Jessica stood at the edge of the living room, hands clasped in front of her, fighting the tremor in her voice. For years, she had rehearsed this moment in her mind, imagining how she would tell him, how she would explain the growing emptiness in their marriage. But now that the moment was here, the words felt fragile, ready to break apart before she could string them together. I mean, she took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. I mean us, Arthur. This marriage. I'm not happy anymore. Arthur blinked, clearly taken aback by her bluntness. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his gaze never leaving her face. Jessica, you know things have been busy for me lately. The restaurant expansions, the traveling. But that's temporary. Things will settle down soon. Jessica shook her head, her throat tightening. Arthur, it's not just about you being busy. It's been like this for years. We've been drifting apart, and you haven't even noticed. He frowned, sitting up straighter. I've noticed things have been tough, he said defensively, but I figured that's just life. We've been together for a long time. Sometimes things get routine, but that doesn't mean we're falling apart. Routine? Jessica let out a soft, bitter laugh. Arthur, we don't even talk anymore. We don't see each other. When was the last time we sat down and had a real conversation about anything other than your work or what the staff is doing? Arthur opened his mouth to protest, but no words came. He knew she was right. Their conversations had become transactional at best, discussing schedules, finances, and house matters, but never delving into anything meaningful. The truth of it stung him, but he wasn't ready to admit it yet. He rubbed a hand over his face, letting out a heavy sigh. Is that why you're saying you're unhappy? Because we don't talk enough? Jessica, we can fix that. We can go to counseling, take a vacation, whatever you need. I don't understand why you're bringing this up now. Jessica's chest tightened with frustration. How could she explain it in a way that he would understand? She wasn't just bringing it up now. It had been years in the making. And now, with Adam in the picture, she could no longer ignore the growing chasm between them. Arthur, she said quietly, this isn't just about us talking more. It's about the fact that I feel like we're living separate lives. You're always working, always focused on your next deal, your next business venture. And I've been here, alone, for so long. Arthur's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing slightly. Alone? Jessica, you have everything you could ever need. You have this house, the staff, everything. How can you say you're alone? Jessica's frustration boiled over. You don't get it, do you? None of that matters if I feel invisible in my own marriage. I don't care about the house or the money or the parties. I care about us, and we've been falling apart for years. You just never noticed because you were too busy with everything else. Arthur stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief. So, what are you saying? He asked, his voice low and tense. Are you saying you want a divorce? The word hit Jessica like a slap. She hadn't said it yet, hadn't even let herself fully consider it, but hearing it aloud made it real. Was that what she wanted? Was that where they were headed? I don't know, she admitted, her voice shaking, but I can't keep pretending that everything is fine when it's not. Arthur stood up abruptly, his tall frame towering over her. His eyes were cold now, the confusion replaced with anger. Is this about someone else? He asked, his voice tight. Is that what this is? You found someone else? Jessica's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected him to go there, hadn't anticipated how quickly the conversation would turn. Her heart raced as the truth hovered on the edge of her lips, but she couldn't say it. Not yet. No, she said, her voice too quick, too defensive. This is about us. About what's been missing between us for years. Arthur stared at her for a long moment, his jaw clenched tight. He was quiet for a beat, as if weighing his options, deciding whether to push further. Finally, he let out a bitter laugh and shook his head. I don't believe you, he said, his voice cold. There's something else. I can feel it. You've been distant, distracted. And now you're telling me you're not happy? That's not a coincidence, Jessica. Jessica felt the ground slipping out from under her. She had known this would be difficult, had prepared herself for the confrontation, but Arthur's anger was sharper than she expected. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. How could she explain Adam without admitting everything? Arthur took a step toward her, his eyes hard. Who is it? He demanded. Is it someone from one of those charity events you go to? Someone you've been spending your days with while I've been working my ass off? Jessica shook her head, her chest tightening. Arthur, it's not like that. I felt alone for so long. And Who is it, Jessica? Arthur's voice was louder now, filled with accusation. He wasn't letting it go. Tell me the truth. She stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest, her pulse roaring in her ears. The truth hung between them, heavy and dangerous. She couldn't lie anymore. She couldn't keep pretending. It's Adam, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Arthur's eyes widened, and for a moment, there was a stunned silence. He blinked, as if trying to process what she had just said. Adam? He repeated, his voice low and incredulous. The gardener? Jessica winced at the way he said it, as if Adam's very existence was beneath him, but she couldn't deny it. Yes, she said, her voice trembling. It wasn't supposed to happen, but it did. Arthur let out a harsh laugh, the sound bitter and cold. He turned away from her, running a hand through his hair as if trying to wrap his mind around the revelation. Unbelievable, he muttered, shaking his head. You, my wife, are having an affair with the damn gardener. Jessica felt the tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she fought them back. She couldn't fall apart now, not when everything was crashing down around her. Arthur, I'm sorry, she said, her voice breaking. I never meant for it to happen. He spun around, his eyes blazing with fury. You never meant for it to happen? Is that supposed to make this better? You've been sneaking around with him, while I've been working to give you everything you could ever want. That's just it, Jessica cried, her emotions spilling over. I don't want everything, Arthur. I don't care about the house, or the money, or your business deals. I just wanted you. But you've been gone for so long, so focused on your work, that I didn't know how to reach you anymore. Arthur's face twisted in anger, his hands balling into fists at his sides. So, you decided to cheat on me instead? With the gardener? He spat the word like a curse, his voice filled with venom. I made a mistake, Jessica said, her voice trembling. But a mistake? Arthur cut her off, his voice shaking with rage. This wasn't a mistake, Jessica. You made a choice. A choice to throw everything away for some fling with a guy who mows our lawn. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Jessica could barely breathe, the weight of her confession pressing down on her like a lead blanket. She had expected anger, but not like this. Not this raw, blistering fury that threatened to tear everything apart. Arthur stood there, his chest heaving with every breath, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and disgust. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and cold. I'm leaving. Jessica blinked, her heart skipping a beat. What? I'm leaving, Arthur repeated, his voice firm. I'm not staying in this house with you. Not after this. He turned and stormed out of the living room, grabbing his coat from the chair by the door. Jessica followed him, panic rising in her chest. Arthur, please, she called after him, her voice shaking. We can talk about this. We can work through it. Arthur didn't stop. He threw open the front door, the cold air rushing in like a slap to the face. "No, Jessica," he said, his voice filled with finality. "You made your choice. Now you can live with it." And with that, he stepped outside, slamming the door behind him. Jessica stood frozen in the entryway, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving her gasping for breath. Her world was collapsing around her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The silence that followed was deafening. She was alone. Jessica stood in the entryway, staring at the door that Arthur had just slammed behind him. The sound still echoed in her ears, even as the silence of the empty house pressed in around her. Her world had shattered in a matter of moments, the reality of what she had done finally sinking in. She was alone now, truly alone. Arthur had left, and with him went the last semblance of the life she had been clinging to for so long. The weight of her choices hung heavy on her chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. She wanted to scream, to cry, to run after him and beg him to stay, but she couldn't move. She was frozen, caught between guilt and regret, between the life she had destroyed and the one she wasn't sure she wanted. Finally, after what felt like hours, Jessica moved. Her legs felt weak, and she stumbled toward the living room, collapsing onto the sofa. She buried her face in her hands, her body shaking as the tears finally came, hot and unrelenting. It was as if everything she had been holding in, the guilt, the fear, the loneliness, was pouring out of her all at once, and she couldn't stop it. Arthur was gone. The words kept repeating in her mind, over and over, until they became a dull ache in her chest. She had known this day would come. Deep down, she had always known that their marriage couldn't survive the distance that had grown between them, but she hadn't expected it to end like this, so suddenly, so violently. But as much as the guilt consumed her, a part of her knew that this moment had been inevitable. She had made her choices, and now she was facing the consequences. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling her from her spiral of thoughts. She wiped her tears with the sleeve of her sweater and reached for it, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the name on the screen. Adam. For a moment, she considered ignoring it. Everything was too raw, too fresh, and she wasn't sure she could handle a conversation with him right now. But at the same time, Adam was the only person she could talk to. He was the only one who understood what she was going through, who knew the depth of her unhappiness in a way that Arthur never had. With shaking hands, Jessica swiped to answer the call, pressing the phone to her ear. "Jess?" Adam's voice came through the line, gentle and concerned. "I just saw Arthur drive off. Is everything okay?" Jessica let out a shaky breath, her voice breaking as she spoke. "No," she whispered. "Nothing's okay, Adam. I told him. I told him everything." There was a pause on the other end of the line, as if Adam was processing her words. When he spoke again, his voice was low, filled with concern. "What did he say?" "He's gone," Jessica said, her voice trembling. "He left. I don't know if he's coming back." Adam didn't respond right away, and for a moment, Jessica wondered if he was regretting everything, regretting being involved in the mess she had created. But then he spoke, his voice soft but steady. "Do you want me to come over?" Jessica hesitated, her heart twisting. She wanted to say yes, wanted to feel the comfort of his arms around her, the warmth of his presence. But at the same time, she wasn't sure if she could handle seeing him right now. Everything felt too raw, too fragile. "I don't know," she said honestly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know what to do, Adam." "Hey," he said gently, "you don't have to do anything right now. Just take a breath. Let yourself feel what you're feeling." Jessica closed her eyes, leaning back against the sofa. The tears had stopped, but the ache in her chest hadn't gone away. She felt lost, untethered, as if everything she had known had slipped away, leaving her standing on the edge of a cliff with no way to turn back. "I didn't want it to happen like this," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't want to hurt him." "I know," Adam said softly, "but sometimes things happen that we can't control. You've been unhappy for a long time, Jess. You deserve to feel whole again." The words should have been comforting, but they only made Jessica feel more conflicted. Yes, she had been unhappy for years, but did that justify what she had done? Did it make it okay that she had turned to someone else instead of trying to fix her marriage? "I don't even know what I want anymore," she admitted, her voice shaking. "I thought I did, but now, everything feels so wrong." Adam was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was filled with understanding. "Maybe you don't have to know right now. Maybe you just need time to figure things out." Jessica nodded, even though he couldn't see her. He was right. She didn't have to make any decisions right now. Everything was too fresh, too overwhelming. She needed time to think, to feel, to process everything that had happened. "Can I see you tomorrow?" Adam asked, his voice gentle. "We don't have to talk about any of this if you don't want to. I just want to be there for you." Jessica hesitated again, her heart torn between the need for comfort and the fear of complicating things even more. But the thought of seeing Adam, of having someone to lean on, was too tempting to resist. "Okay," she said quietly. "Tomorrow." "Okay," Adam replied, his voice soft. "I'll text you in the morning. Try to get some rest, Jess. You've been through a lot." "I will," she whispered, though she knew sleep wouldn't come easily that night. They said their goodbyes, and Jessica hung up, setting her phone back on the coffee table. She stared at it for a long moment, her mind racing with 1,000 different thoughts. The house was eerily quiet, and the absence of Arthur's presence was palpable, like a ghost haunting the rooms. Jessica stood and made her way upstairs, her legs heavy as she climbed the steps. When she reached the master bedroom, the room felt cold, empty. The bed, once a place of comfort and rest, now seemed foreign to her, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. She changed into her pajamas and crawled into bed, pulling the blankets up to her chin. The sheets were cool against her skin, and she shivered, though she wasn't sure if it was from the cold or from the emotions swirling inside her. As she lay there in the darkness, her mind replayed the conversation with Arthur over and over again. The look on his face when she told him the truth, the anger in his voice, the sound of the door slamming behind him. It all played like a film reel in her mind, on an endless loop. She had wanted to be honest with him, had wanted to confront the reality of their marriage. But now that it was out in the open, she wasn't sure if she had made the right decision. Everything felt so final, so irreversible. The life they had built together, the years of memories, the shared dreams. It was all crumbling around her, and she didn't know how to stop it. Tears welled in her eyes again, and this time, she didn't try to hold them back. She let them fall, silent and heavy, soaking into the pillow beneath her. She had no idea what the future held, no idea what would happen tomorrow or the day after that. All she knew was that everything had changed, and there was no going back. The next morning, Jessica woke to the soft light of dawn filtering through the curtains. Her eyes were puffy from crying, and her body ached from the tension she had carried all night. She felt hollow, as if the weight of everything had drained her of any remaining strength. She reached for her phone on the nightstand and saw a message from Adam. "Thinking of you. Let me know if you're ready to talk." Jessica stared at the message for a long moment, her heart heavy with uncertainty. She wanted to talk to Adam, to feel the warmth of his presence, but at the same time, she was terrified of what that meant. If she let him in now, there would be no more denying what was happening between them. And she wasn't sure if she was ready for that. With a deep breath, she typed out a reply. "Come over around noon." She hit send before she could change her mind, then set the phone down and got out of bed. The day stretched out before her like a blank slate, filled with possibilities, but also with the weight of decisions she wasn't ready to make. As she stood by the window, staring out at the snow-covered garden, she realized that her life had been heading toward this moment for a long time. Arthur's departure, her connection with Adam, it was all part of a larger unraveling, one that had begun years ago. Now, she had to figure out what came next. And for the first time in a long time, Jessica didn't have the answers. Noon came faster than Jessica expected. The house was still and silent, the tension from the previous night lingering like a cloud she couldn't shake. When Adam arrived, his familiar knock at the back door felt both comforting and heavy with meaning. Jessica opened the door, her heart pounding in her chest. Adam stood there, bundled against the cold, but the warmth in his eyes reached her instantly. There was no pretense, no mask, just him, just her. She stepped aside to let him in, the space between them shrinking with each passing second. "I'm glad you came," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I told you I'd be here," Adam replied softly, stepping inside. They stood in the kitchen for a moment, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. Finally, Adam reached out, taking her hand in his, and just like that, the dam broke. Jessica felt the tears well up again, and this time, she didn't fight them. Adam pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as she cried against his chest. For the first time in months, Jessica felt like she could breathe. She didn't know what the future held, didn't know what would happen with Arthur or if her marriage could be salvaged. But in Adam's arms, she felt safe. She felt seen. And for now, that was enough. As the afternoon wore on, they sat together in the living room, talking quietly about everything and nothing. Jessica didn't have all the answers yet, and she wasn't sure she ever would. But as she sat beside Adam, their fingers intertwined, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It wasn't much, and it wasn't clear. But it was there, a small, fragile light in the midst of all the chaos. And for the first time in a long time, Jessica allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things would be okay. In time. Subscribe to the channel and like this story if you liked it. Turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories. Click on the playlist on the right to listen to previous stories. See you soon.